Hey, Low Code Approach listeners, this is Wendy Haddad. Before we jump into this week's episode, I wanted to let you know that we are starting to plan for the next season, and we want to make sure we hear from you on what is most important and relevant in terms of the topics that we'll be choosing. So if you could open a web browser and pop over to aka.ms/low code topic request, that's aka.ms/low code topic request, all one word. Fill out that brief survey on what topics and what subjects, what guests you might want to hear from. And who knows, maybe it'll make it into the next season of the podcast. Thanks so much and happy listening.
Hey everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Low Code Approach. I am Sean Feeney, a Senior Product Marketing Manager on the Power Platform team, and I'm joined by...
I'm Wendy Haddad. I am a Senior Cloud Solution Architect, a delivery lead, and a former Microsoft customer. And I am joined by...
a person who is ready for some serious growth today. Maybe like I'm sitting by a Laskewitz, a wake, or something along those lines. Ken Aguillard here with the soothing sounds and mellow tones today. Back over to you, Wendy.
You're cracking me up. Well, we have two very special guests. We've got Carsten Groth and Daniel Laskewitz. And I apologize if I didn't say your names correctly. You'll have to correct me on the podcast here. Carsten is from our Global Black Belt team. He's a senior technical specialist. And we're trying to figure out what Daniel's job is. So Daniel, you're going to have to describe that to us. A senior cloud advocate. So Daniel, you start with you. What do you do here at Microsoft? What is a senior cloud advocate?
Yeah, to me, it's also a surprise what a senior cloud advocate is. No, I already know. So a senior cloud advocate is basically somebody who is in between the product team and the community. So what we do is we talk to the product team all the time about feedback that we get from the community, for instance, but also on new features that they build. And then they will ask us questions like, is this a good idea, for instance? Do you have feedback about that already? Do you know customers that already have asked you that question? So those kinds of communication, that's what we do with the product team, for instance. And on the other side, we present a lot to community. So we're at a lot of community events. We will probably be at the Power Platform Conference or Power Platform Community Conference. I still have to get used to the new name. And the European Power Platform Conference, for instance, as well. And we will present about all kinds of products that we have in the Power Platform, of course.
So what I just heard Daniel say is he's basically a condiment. He makes everything better. You are the layers in between the community and in between the product. That's what I just heard.
Or maybe the icing on the cake, like that middle layer.
He said he's the middle. So I think maybe Carsten is maybe the icing on the cake since he's the black belt.
That certainly depends on Ken. Yeah, so let me explain what a global black belt does, because for some, it's this acronym well known by SAP, for instance, or Six Sigma. And in Microsoft, for instance, the global black belt team, we are a pre-sales team. So we are supporting our field sellers in terms of answering the tough questions around architectural, technical deep dive around Power Platform. And we are not focused just on the Power Platform. So we do have business applications and Azure and Power BI, Fabric, you name it, inside our team as well. And we are trying to be where our customers are. So most of the times we are traveling. So my team is EMEA based. So I'm traveling a lot inside the EMEA region. But same as Daniel already mentioned, I'm also traveling and enjoying the community events. So my last one was the Color Cloud in Hamburg last week. And hopefully we see each others at European Power Platform Conference, Daniel.
Yeah, I really hope to see you there as well. And are any of the other hosts coming?
I will.
To Europe?
I'll be there.
Oh, nice.
I might show up. It depends, right? I'm still a brown belt, so I haven't black belt yet.
Depends on what? On me transferring you into a Dr. Copilot?
That would be absolutely wonderful. And if I had a lot of AI and Copilot things to talk about, but my favorite topic is governance and security. But before I get on my soapbox of those things, let's maybe talk about Copilot and Azure AI Studio. Like, what are they and how are they different? Like, why do we have two things? Who wants to go first?
Yeah, we're European, so we can't decide. We always want the other to be the first one.
You are very polite, yes.
Nice.
Yeah, so I take the tough one first, which is Azure AI Studio. So Azure AI Studio is a comprehensive platform for building, deploying, and managing AI solutions. So with AI Studio, for instance, you can create these innovative AI applications, explore and discover various AI models, or you can even connect to other AI services. So what about Copilot Studio, Daniel?
Yeah, so Copilot Studio is our low-code Copilot offering that we have. So whenever you want to, for instance, build your own custom Copilot, and Copilot is a bit of a new name for a chatbot. We used to call it a chatbot, but now it's a little bit more knowledgeable. I think that's the biggest change that is in there. You can build your own custom Copilot inside of Copilot Studio, and you can also extend the Copilots that are already out there. So for instance, if you already have a Copilot inside of one of the Microsoft products, so for instance, Microsoft 365 has a Copilot, you can extend that within Copilot Studio as well. And what's really cool about Copilot Studio is that it offers a bunch of like accelerators. I kind of call it like that because normally when you would use the Azure services, it will require a lot more configuration or deployment. And with Copilot Studio, you sometimes have like an accelerator to make it easier for you to deploy it to, for instance, Teams or to deploy it to your website. And there's some kind of shortcuts that you have with Copilot Studio that probably will take a little bit more time with Azure AI Studio for that.
Daniel, I want to double click on your claim that the Copilot Studio is a low-code platform, because I think this is very important for our customers to understand what they're getting into with this. So with Power Apps or Power Automate, I'm able to create an app or automation without ever, I would say no code, without ever creating code. So when we say low code, what kinds of skill sets are needed? And in the kind of the context of Fusion teams, is it possible for non-developers to get pretty far with Copilot Studios and then bring in a Fusion team for that coding piece? Or are we really just saying this tool is only intended for our IT developers?
No, we can use Copilot Studio for multiple roles, basically. So we have the real low code or no code experience because, for instance, within a Copilot, you have topics, which are subjects within the Copilot. And you can, for instance, create those with natural language. So you can create those with a Copilot in Copilot Studio. So a lot of Copilots in there. But you can, for instance, just write in natural language what you want to have as a topic, and it will generate that. So there's like a really low code area in Copilot Studio, but you can also have really more of the Fusion dev kind of experience where you would, for instance, create a bot framework skill, which is more of a coding kind of experience, or you can plug in certain Azure, more pro code kind of experiences inside of Copilot Studio as well. So you can, and that's maybe also the thing that will be a little bit difficult for customers to understand, because I've seen a bunch of the documentation, etc., from certain community people that are talking about Copilot Studio and AI Studio. And they kind of say, well, on the left, we have Copilot Studio, and on the right, we have Azure AI Studio, and Azure AI Studio is pro dev, and Copilot Studio is low code, basically. And that's the difference that you have there. But I think you can also combine the two, for instance. So you can use Azure AI Studio as well together with Copilot Studio. And that's more of a hybrid scenario. Sometimes one of the scenarios that you use with Copilot Studio can be pretty pro dev, even more pro dev than the Azure AI Studio side, which is sometimes also like really clicky experience, pretty simple and pretty low code. And I think the nuances there are really important. And a lot of people have no clue that there is a low code experience, for instance, in Azure. So they have a feeling that whenever it's Azure, it's already code and all they do is code. But I see a lot of AI people that are working inside of Azure. And that's something that where people are always clicking around and using low code tools as well for AI. And that's something that a lot of people have no idea about, basically.
So I've got a follow-up question to that, and I think this will make things as clear as mud for everyone. But I've got my model and I've got my data set that I want to bring into Copilot. right? Where do I start? Do I start in Azure AI Studio? Do I start in Copilot? Or is this, to know where to start, I need to know what the outcome is going to be, right? So like, what helps me decide what path I need to take? Carsten, and I'd love your take on that.
Yeah, and I would answer it with neither one of these that you mentioned, because in general, this is something that we've seen, for instance, in our last AI hackathon during the Color Cloud as well. People tend to start immediately by selecting a tool and then jumping into this and exploring what the tool looks like, how they can do stuff. And then there is the other approach, more these kind of, I would call them project managers, which are coming from the fact of, here's a description of my use case. So they would basically describe what they really want to serve inside their solution. And what we told them, and this is definitely my advice to start with, is we do have fantastic implementation guidelines, both for the Copilot Studio as well as for the Azure AI Studio. And the implementation guides basically helps you orchestrating the stuff where you should get started. Because a lot of times, like I mentioned, we are talking about tools, and there are various tools, for instance, to drill in something or basically to explore the way and artificial art that is needed to orchestrate your project. But in the end of the day, what it is really about is to find a structured way of planning your project and then define the outcomes that you're trying to achieve. Because sometimes I would say you tend to put in a tool and then you're using the tool and you're kind of disappointed. And I give you an example, Sean, which is about the fact of, you mentioned a large language model being in place and maybe some data in place. So let me explain the fact that some people starting with simply SharePoint stuff, right? Because it's so deep and so near and dear to them, that they're trying to open up Microsoft Copilot Studio. And we told them, for instance, in our documentation, put inside a SharePoint URL. And then all of a sudden it starts working and they start asking the first question and they are kind of disappointed about the reaction of the large language model. And this disappointment factor is something that we tend to overlook because, of course, if you're deeper in technology, you start to explore why this happens. But if you are maybe a business user, you're like, what's wrong? My large language model replied with an error message, or it doesn't even reply to say, sorry, I can't help with that. And then you're continuously in that. And I think there are better ways for us to do this. And there are also better ways for us, Microsoft, to improve our documentation around this. I guess Daniel has some examples like these as well, right?
Yeah. So, for instance, if you look at the SharePoint example, that's one of the, I think a lot of people will like that scenario because SharePoint is so widespread already. A lot of people already use it because they, for instance, use Teams, and the backend of that when you use files in Teams is, of course, SharePoint. But there are also tons of scenarios that we show where you can use public websites or maybe even your own documents if you want to. And I see a lot of scenarios with customers that want to also connect with all the 1,200 plus connectors that we have within the Power Platform, for instance, to include the data into their scenarios with Copilot. And that could be from certain scenarios, of course, because it could be their own custom Copilot that they want to expose on their website, on their public website, for instance. But they also sometimes come from a different experience, and they might have had Copilot from Microsoft 365 licenses, for instance, to work with Word, Excel, PowerPoint, those kinds of tools. And then they want to extend that and bring their own data into that Copilot as well. And that's also a really good scenario for those Copilot Studio.
Yeah, and to add to this, I think this is why we are having the implementation guide, right? Because this is in general where it helps in terms of then estimating, am I in the right tool experience? And of course, avoiding such situations, because many times, for instance, inside the hackathon, we figured out that, for instance, and I know that you would love this, there are some settings behind the scenes by a typical administrator, which is avoiding Copilot or large language models to come up with the right answer, right?
Wait, no, things on the back end.
Yeah, absolutely. So sometimes we tend to say that there's one team who is the administrational team of everything in companies, right? But in fact, we see multiple teams ongoing at companies orchestrating and administrating stuff. And what we see, for instance, in that SharePoint example is that, for instance, the SharePoint administrator set up some purview and some sentiment tags around these kind of things. And that allows Copilot to not basically offer the answer.
So, quick question. Lisa Crosby recently did a video on this same topic where we talk about Azure AI services and Azure AI Studio and Copilot Studio. And she brings up a good topic of cost, right? But this is cost of like compute and like actually running this. But let's actually flip cost on to cost of the resources and the team members needed to manage and create and develop these copilots. And with that, if we think about the cost of those resources, how does that help drive ROI for organizations when they look at the deployment and implementation of AI and copilots in their organization? Daniel, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so if you look at, for instance, Copilot Studio, I already gave the example as well for publishing it to Teams, for instance, one of those accelerators. Normally, when you would have to configure that in the Azure world, that would cost you a lot more time, for instance, to do that. But then when you have to maintain it, for instance, there's also way more nuts and bolts that you have to maintain, for instance, where with Copilot Studio, it's a little more managed in that case. So it's less things that you need to think of when you are managing those solutions. So that's something that's completely a thing that flips on the right side of Copilot Studio, of course. So that will, for the ROI, for instance, that will flip the scale in the direction of the Copilot Studio area, of course. I think that what I just said about the fact that it's not as black and white as most people say, with Copilot Studio on one side and Azure AI Studio on the other side, I think that also sometimes it can be a benefit of using two things at the same time, for instance. So when you want to use Copilot Studio and Azure AI Studio together, it could offer something as well with the newer models, for instance, because Copilot Studio, because it is managed and because it is more of a low-code approach, it's also something that will go a little bit slower with the adoption of the new models. So if you look at, for instance, the Azure OpenAI models, for instance, they are also already at 4 Turbo, I believe it is. So it's already a little bit further. And if you look at Copilot Studio, that's already in, I believe, 3.5 Turbo, 3.5 Turbo, something in there. So there's a little bit of a difference in how quickly they adopt the newer models that can do more things as well and more tokens, etc. So if you work them together, Copilot Studio and Azure AI Studio, you can even use both of them, and that might be a little bit better.
I want to pull us back for a minute. So Daniel, a lot of our listeners, they understand the Power Platform, they understand low code. AI is new. And so you're talking about models, you're talking about selecting models, you're talking about selecting tools based on the models. What does that mean? Like, why would I care about certain models? And can you give me kind of a high level overview of some of the, maybe which model when, as well as which tool when?
So models have characteristics. They can have, for instance, also the training data that's behind there. So for instance, if you have an older model, it will also be trained on older data. I don't know if you ever had that when you ask a question to Copilot or in Bing, for instance, and not all the answers that you wanted or not the most relevant recent data was there. That could be an example of why you want a newer model, for instance, because it's trained on newer data and it will also have access to newer data. So that is one of the characteristics of a model, why you want, for instance, a newer model instead of an older one. Does that make a little sense?
Yeah, I think it does. And then an open question, Carsten, feel free to jump in on this as well. As much as I think Copilot is the perfect name, I don't think we do ourselves always a service of having so many things called Copilot. And, you know, marketing people close their ears for a moment on that.
Ouch, my everything.
Well, but seriously, and so I think it's confusing. So when you talk about, you know, I was talking with a customer last week on this, and it took us a long time to figure out that they were talking about a completely different Copilot than what they'd originally emailed us about. And so can you help us understand where Copilot Studio let's focus on Copilot Studio for a moment because of the branding. Where does it integrate with the other copilots in our suite? And where is it, when you say build your own copilot, what does that mean?
Maybe start with the easy question here, Carsten.
The easy
Copilot with, Copilot.
Copilot with or Copilot in, you know?
Yeah.
So these are basically the two kind of things that you need to remember. And I mean, you're talking from the bottom of my heart, because basically when I talk to my customers and our customers, is of course, it's always confusing them when we, for instance, call everything Copilot, like you mentioned. And then we do have something which is the tool, which is Copilot Studio. And even Studio then is confusing for some, because yes, it's a studio where you can compose something, but it's also a studio where you can test something. And then there might be different ways of using the studio as well. So very, very interesting. But I think in general, kind of a rule of thumb that I'm taking here, which is Copilot Studio is basically the orchestrator. Whenever we are talking about orchestrating something, we are talking about MCS or Microsoft Copilot Studio. While when we are talking Copilot, we need to make the distinction between Copilot with an upper C or Copilot with a lower C. And that is something typical Microsoft coming up with these kind of things. So everything which is capital C, Copilot, means it's a first-party Copilot offering by Microsoft. And a lower C means it's a Copilot or custom Copilot made and created by customers.
Cough, cough, Teams. No, continue, because it's very similar, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Daniel, want to add something to this?
Yeah, I think if you look at Copilots, the naming, I think it's a great name for what it does, but it can get really confusing. I know that a lot of people have asked me, for instance, is there a documentation page on Copilot so I know which Copilots are there? Can we kind of have an overall view, because I get lost a lot? So I think we still have a bit of work to do there to make sure that our customers also will understand all the different Copilots and also these kinds of snippets that Carsten just shared about, for instance, the capital C or the lowercase c. I think that's a really nice one to add to our documentation, for instance.
Hey, so Carsten and Daniel, it's time to wrap the show. Real fast, is there anything that you'd like to drive people's attention towards as they start or they continue and mature their Copilot journey, such as like customer success stories or any training materials? I know, Carsten, you mentioned the implementation guide. We will put a link for that in the show notes. But is there anything else that you'd like to bring to people's attention?
Yeah, so from my point of view, if you're interested in how others are doing and working with responsible AI, please go and visit our customer success stories. We got some great stories in there. I recently was with AN Post, for instance, the Irish Postal Service, and exploring with them how they can basically use the most value and get the most value out of the Microsoft Copilot Studio. And there are so many beloved stories around these kind of things, which are gold nuggets to me, because it might be inspirational for other customers to start their generative AI story.
Yeah, and I would also add on that, if you want to learn more about Copilot Studio and Azure AI Studio, make sure to keep an eye out for Build next month, because then a lot of new features and new sessions, etc., will be around to learn more about all these products. So make sure to stay there as well.
So you're saying Build is not only for developers?
No, it is pointed at developers, but there is going to be some news as well on the non-developer area.
Yeah, no, it's well, like you said, everybody is a solution developer when it comes to low code and to pro code. So I appreciate that so much. And no spoilers, Daniel, on Build. That's my marketing hat being put on. So thank you so much for joining us today. This has been such an amazing episode that we are going to have to do another one with you too. So thank you again. And listeners, we'll see you in part 2.